Hello, art historians, and welcome to our first lecture of our next ism. So we are following up Romanticism by moving into Realism, which is going to be just after Romanticism. Even though Romanticism will really keep going, this one is going to kind of build off of it. So it's really important to remember that all of these isms, so Rococo to Neoclassicism to Romanticism to Realism, all of them are going to build off of the previous ism before it, because they're all based on beliefs. And ism is generally like an ideology or belief or perspective. And all of these different movements have a different perspective on how art should be shown, or the content of art. So what we're going to see is realism is what we consider to be the first modernist art movement. And so let's talk about what we mean by modernist. Modernists don't like to focus on the classical past anymore. They're like, okay, we've done it to death. We have done, even in Romanticism, Liberty Leading the People had a romanticist kind of, or a neoclassical touch to it. So with the liberty, you know, like the statue, the idea of liberty leading the people. These guys are over it, all right? The Industrial Revolution was the future. We were moving forward. We needed to stop looking to the past and move ahead. We also see the development of capitalism. Capitalism, because of the Industrial Revolution, we start to get varying different social classes. And that includes a middle and lower class who want art that they can relate to and they can understand. They don't always have the knowledge of the stories of the past that are referenced in Romanticist and classical art. It's like an inside joke that they don't really get. Plus, they don't really have, it's not their worlds. They're working in factories all the time. They're living in horrible conditions. They don't want to look at, you know, stories about issues and things that they're not trying to solve, but that actually have to do with them, all right? So it's all of these things that are like, we need to move forward. We need to stop living in the past. We have to stop worrying about history so much. We need to focus on the now if we're going to get anything changed. And Romanticism has kind of started on that, but these guys are kind of over it. They're over the religion. They're over the history. They're over the classical past. We need to move forward. And a big important thing to think about is with these isms, we're really talking about the content. So neoclassical, Rococo, Romanticist, all of these were ideas about what the content of art should be, what should be shown. It was this idea for the longest time that the only things worthy of the time it takes to create art should be things from the past, things that are heroic, things that are biblical. But we're starting to change that. This idea of with Romanticism and Realism is the content should be more about the now instead. Like that is just as important as the past. So Romanticism is kind of leading into Realism in the fact that Romanticists don't really paint things how they actually are. It's kind of over the top, exaggerated. You know, I mean, you could never really, like, when you look at Delacroix with Liberty Leading the People, that's not realistic. It may be naturalistic, but not realistic. The Grand Odalisque, in the Slave Ship, it's not necessarily him painting it in a realistic way. These guys, the realists, are like, okay, enough with the past. If it's not real, don't paint it. All right, it doesn't have to look naturalistic, but it needs to be real, and it needs to be modern, and it needs to be now. If you couldn't see it in the past, you can't go back and paint stuff from the past. Paint what is right in front of you, because J.M.W. Turner was not there to see the slave ship. Dominique Ingres, or excuse me, Delacroix was not there to see Liberty Leading the People. These guys are like, if you couldn't see it, don't paint it. All right, that's enough of the past. We need to focus on the now and the way things actually look. And if we're going to make advances and bring reality to how society actually is, we have to paint it in the now so that people can take it seriously. So realism is the first true ism and movement in art that people consider to be truly modern. All right, so like it's happening right now in this time. So realists are considered to be what is the first avant-garde art movement, which means they're taking a risk. So the name actually comes from a military term where the avant-garde was usually the first soldier or the first group to run into the battle, which means they're the ones taking the most risk. They're the ones most likely to get hurt by what they are doing, but they take the risk anyway. So realists were considered the first avant-garde because they were more than happy to break away from the norm, to say, okay, we're going to break away from this. We're going to try something different and just paint what is now. And that is okay. So we're going to move forward. So realists kind of have an attitude that really kind of sets the stage for here on. And one of the things that these guys had a huge problem with was the French Royal Academy. The French Royal Academy, set up by Louis XIV, dictated what was worthy of being in art. And according to the French Academy set by Louis XIV, the only things worthy of being painted and the only things they would train you to paint and the only things they would allow to be shown in their salons or their museums was things from the past, things that were what they considered important events, like biblical events, military history, moral messages, classical ideas, Greek and Roman ideas. And these guys were like, are you kidding me? That's the only way we're going to get trained. It's the only way we're going to get in the academy. It's the only way we're going to get our work shown. They rebelled against this. The realists were really rebellions against the man or the institution that said what good art was. And these guys were like, no, we want to change society. But the only way we're going to do that is by showing things how they truly, really are, what is right in front of us. We have to be painting things of the present, and they don't have to be big, important, grand events. They can be just simple, small things. And they're almost kind of parallel to these rebellions against society at the time, who are rebelling against the fact that the upper class is making all the money in industrial societies while the workers are making next to nothing. So realists believe that modern art means modern art. You're painting things that are now. And it doesn't have to be some over-the-top extreme event. It can just be painting what is now. And it doesn't have to be tinted with emotions or over-dramatic art styles. It's not an expression of an internal thing. It's just painting what is on the outside. It is just, this is what it is, and if it creates a feeling in you, good, all right? But we're going to paint things as they actually should be, was right in front of us. So this was actually the result of a new theory at the time that was coming out that's called positivism, and it's that any knowledge should come from your positive, you saw it, right? So positive doesn't necessarily mean good, but anything that you're going to say is true needs to come from positive experience and positive tests. Like you can see it right in front of you. So this idea weaves its way into art, that don't paint something a certain way if you didn't see it that way. You need to be positively true that this is how it looked, this is how it was. And these guys were going to do that. They were going to paint on what they could observe and what they could see. So realism, okay, and naturalism are two very different things that we need to review. Naturalism is painting something so that it looks natural or real. And you could paint things that you'd never actually see, like angels or gods or goddesses or things like that. You could paint those in very natural ways. So for example, from the Northern Renaissance, the Marode altarpiece, very, very natural, not realistic that a couple would come home and see Mary being visited by an angel in their house telling her that she was going to have the baby Jesus. That's not realistic, but the detail was incredibly natural, right? Looked incredibly picture perfect, all right? However, realism, this idea of painting only what you can see in front of you, that is going to be this much newer idea, all right? So realism is really going to step in with this idea that you don't change it, You don't exaggerate it. You don't alter it. You paint what you see. Does that mean it has to look natural? No. This picture down below you is actually a lithograph, kind of like a cartoon, if you will, but very realistic of something that this guy saw that actually happened. So the whole idea behind realist, and we're going to talk about this quote by Gustave Courbet, is show me an angel and I'll paint one. Realists are like, if you can't actually see it and you weren't actually there, don't paint it. Does it have to look natural? No. But does it need to be something you could have seen? Yes. So what won't you see in realism? Togas. Why? Nobody realistically wears togas. Myths, Greek and Roman myths. Those weren't real and they didn't see them. Historical scenes? No, because they weren't there to see them. Classical events? No, they weren't there to see them. Stuff from the Bible? No, because they weren't there to see them. If you haven't seen it and it's not of modern times that you could have seen, then don't paint it. Now, this is actually, we talked about Romanticism kind of being a literary event, and realism is going to be the same way because there are going to be a lot of books that are based on this idea. So Charles Dickens, for example, was a realist author with a little bit of a romanticist touch because sometimes it was a little bit imaginative. But for example, he wrote A Christmas Carol, which nobody really seems to realize that that's not so much about Scrooge as it is about Tiny Tim. And the fact that realistically in England at that time, children were dying and suffering and people were going to poorhouses and being worked to death while the rich people had all of this money. That was realism. Oliver Twist, a little boy who becomes a pickpocket and works in a poorhouse. Literary realism was very popular because it spoke to the common everyday person. Realism was relatable, if you want to put those things together. Like a working class man out of a factory wouldn't have gotten romanticism. I mean, he wouldn't have gotten the grand odalisque. He wouldn't have gotten what Turner was feeling. But realism, they could get it because that related to what they were going through and what they were experiencing in their own time. So the founder of the realist movement is going to be French, of course, because these movements all kind of build off each other in France. And that's going to be Gustave Courbet. And Courbet was kind of a bad boy of art. But his big quote was that quote, show me an angel and I'll paint one. Realism should be about painting what you see in the time that you lived. He hated neoclassicists because that was too much from the past and too cerebral. It's almost like a joke people didn't get. Romanticist was way too emotional. This guy was like, nope, we need to just paint the here and the now. But he did love, and this is important, the techniques of artists that were from other periods. Vermeer and his naturalism. Rembrandt with his use of shadows and the psychology behind it. Bruegel, Caravaggio, who was very, very naturalistic. And not all realistic artists are naturalists, but some are. And he believed that art should have a social purpose, like the Romanticists, but not with all this emotion involved. It should just be show people how it is and let them interpret it for themselves. He was very outspoken. In fact, he really was considered to be a socialist/communist supporter, speaking up for like the common man, and actually got in trouble for ripping down a statue of Napoleon because he was anti that. So this is actually a self-portrait of Gustave Courbet that he did. And Courbet was so against the Royal Academy of France. He hated the way they trained their artists. He hated the selection process. He hated that they were so narrow in their thinking in terms of what art was. So he got angry and he opened the first exhibition of art outside of the salon, where he was like, it shouldn't be up to these people to decide what art is. It should be up for the masses to decide, and it should be everyone to see. So he created what was called the Pavilion of Realism. Now, this may have been a little bit salty because he didn't get accepted into the Royal Academy. It was rejected. But he's like, you know what? This stuff needs to get out here. People need to see it. So he kind of moved the art world out of the academies, these royal academies, and instead moved it into the public where real people could see it and judge it for themselves. So after the French Revolution, and this kind of comes from this idea that they were against the elite and the upper class. So there was this idea that art should start to be for public exhibition, for everyone to see and to judge, and not just the upper class or the elite. So, for example, the Louvre Museum in Paris used to be a palace. It was a royal palace where they held a great deal of art. But during the revolution, it turned into a museum where everybody could have access, even the lower classes, to this art, that they could see it, that it's not just for one group, art is for everyone. And museums, because of the realists, started to become places of civic and national pride, where people could take pride in what they have in these museums and the artists that they have. So for example, in the art museum, Kansas City has a Caravaggio. That's huge that they have a Caravaggio. And it's this great source of pride for Kansas City that they've got this museum that's got so many great artists that we will study. So museums stopped being elite and start moving towards the public, but they hadn't yet been really catered towards the public. So instead of it being the French salon that showed the art every year and deciding what was acceptable, the realists were the first artists to go, well, you know what, forget it. We're going to display our art for everyone to see and let them decide what is good. So for example, he did this painting. This is Gustave Courbet's Burial at Ornans, which is not on the 250. But you can see here, this was a burial of a common man in Ornans, which is where he's from. It is not a rich, wealthy person. It's not a hero. It's not a king. It's just a burial. And he shows it in a very, very realistic way. He uses realistic colors. He shows what people would actually be doing during a long funeral mass that's taking forever. And it's huge. This painting is absolutely massive. And people were like, why did you waste so much ink, oil, and canvas to create a painting about no one? And he's like, because no one is just as important as someone. This is a real scene of what this would look like. A dog wandered in. Some women are crying. The kids are bored. If you look at all of them, even the altar boy is asking the priest, when is this going to be over? Even the priests are looking bored. I mean, it's like, this is how a funeral would look for no one. And it's because it's a no one. And he felt this was just as important as showing the burial of somebody incredibly important. So Courbet does have an agenda. He is an early socialist, early communist. He was really fighting for the working class. And these ideas of socialism and communism were really brewing in places, industrial places like Britain and the United States, who later decided to do reforms so that communism wouldn't take hold there. So for example, the Progressive Party in the United States, the Labor Party in Britain, creating minimum wages and child labor laws. But not every place did that, which is why communism will, spring up in those areas. But Courbet even got thrown in jail at some points because his ideas and his art were considered dangerous because he was glamorizing the hardships of the lower class. So for example, this one of this woman who's done such laborious work, she's fallen asleep with her work in her hands. So he was very, very passionate about what he was doing and using his art to show the hard work and mistreatment of lower class people. So the work for the 250 that was chosen for Gustave Courbet is the Stonebreakers. And it is very naturalistic because he does paint it in kind of a photorealistic way. That's how it naturally looks, because he was inspired by so many naturalist artists, where not all of them are. But you can see here he's painted a very realistic scene, something that he stumbled by and saw of an old man working with a young man breaking stones by the road. They have their lunch there with them. They're doing this back-breaking laborious work, and he deliberately makes it so that only one little sliver, just the way he positioned himself here. He didn't paint this out of imagination. He painted it realistically, but the way he positioned himself with this hill in the background, he only showed so much of the sky as a way to kind of show like there really isn't much hope here. Like for these people, they're going to start young as the young man on the left, and it's going to be something they do all their lives. They're going to be trapped in poverty and backbreaking work their entire lives. And notice that their faces are kind of covered because to them, it doesn't really matter what their face is because they're just a people, a group of people who are going to be suffering through these miserable conditions. It's about an experience, not necessarily a specific person. So he said he stopped to consider two men breaking stones on the highway. It's rare to meet the most complete expression of poverty, so an idea for a picture came to me on the spot. All right. So he brought them into his studio after kind of figuring out how he wanted to compose this. And it's this idea that their clothes are tattered, their faces are covered. Life begins hard and it ends hard. This back-breaking, stone-breaking work. All right. So he also was kind of glamorizing the fact that they are the society upon which they're the rock on which society is built, but they're hammered to death. Now, that's his internal agenda, but you didn't have to know that to understand how hard this is. And the Salon completely rejected this. They're like, it's not anything important. It's not an important scene. And he's like, who are you to say what's important? It is important that people see this. And it's done very, very large. It's a very big painting. And they're like, it's too gritty. It's too dark. And he's like, yeah, because it's dark and it's dirty and it's miserable. And that's what realism was all about. So Stonebreakers was actually considered to be the first artistic socialist scene, written only 1 year after Karl Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto. And people said that this was basically saying that the lower class should rise up and break their chains and overthrow the factory owners and the bourgeoisie working class and break off their chains and be free from this miserable experience. All right. Now, unfortunately, because of this, it's almost going to become a witch hunt that anybody who painted scenes like this was going to start to become seen as pro-socialist because they're glorifying the working class. But that wasn't actually the case of all of them. So, for example, Honoré Daumier, this was actually the guy who did the picture of Nadar elevating photography to the height of an art because he was very threatened by photography, as a lot of these realist artists were, that who can capture reality better than a photograph. So they wanted to say that photography wasn't an art form. But what he did is create lithographs, which is a graphic art using wax crayon on a tablet. So like you would dip it and then the wax would collect the ink and then you would stamp it. But he wasn't painting it like Honoré Daumier I'm showing you because he wasn't painting in a naturalistic way. It doesn't look realistic or like natural, but it is a very realistic scene. Realistic does not mean real looking, but what is shown is real. So he's actually famous, Honoré Daumier, not on the 250, for doing the third class carriage, which shows these people living in poverty with the rich people in the upper carriages, who we can obviously tell because of their top hats, with their back turned to them. So you've got a woman nursing a baby, you've got a man sitting there with like ratty, tattered clothes on, and it's not naturalistic. It's not how it naturally looks. It's not photo quality. However, it is a very real picture of something that he would have and probably did see on a daily basis. So Daumier, you can see right here on the right, he's a caricature artist. He likes to kind of use satire and make fun of things, which is why he used that to kind of make fun of Nadar, because he didn't like that Nadar was saying that photographs were also an art form. And lithography is, again, printmaking, where wax crayon is drawn onto a surface and then dipped in ink and then applied to the surface. And why did he like it? Because it's cheaper than etching and engraving. That wax crayon was something that he could easily get and mass produce cheaper, so that way the poorer classes could see these too, these graphic cartoons and caricatures that he's creating, such as this one, which is called the Rue Transnonian, which is the street Transnonian. And what had happened is there was a labor strike going on at the time. And so there were police who were being sent out to kind of keep an eye on things. And a police officer was shot from a window in a tenement house, which is kind of like a very cheap apartment building. And the police went inside and opened fire and killed innocent people sleeping in their beds. And this one really, really bothers me because Daumier would have seen it. And this is a lithograph that was mass put out so people could see how the working class were being treated, that they were woken from their beds and killed. And you can see a woman laying off to the side, a man, a baby, and then maybe an elderly father or grandfather that they'd just been woken from their sleep. Very realistic scene. Nothing about this is to be glorified or from the past. This is a now event of something that actually could have happened. And he used that lithograph to get this out where more people could see it. We also have artists like Jean-Francois Milay, who also glorified the peasant class and the working class, and painted them working on the land. And he actually got in trouble because people were like, oh, you're painting socialist scenes, you're trying to send a communist message, which he denied. He just truly admired the grit of these working class people. And unlike romanticists who were doing kind of imagined landscapes, he was like, no, I want real landscapes of what people are actually doing with the land. So for example, this is the gleaners. And the gleaners here are actually picking up, after the harvest is over, they were allowed to go back and pick up anything that they could glean, just find of these little pieces of grain that were left that they could take home and maybe make a loaf of bread out of. Whereas you can see all of the grain that they've harvested is going off to be sold in the background. So just another picture of Milay. All right, so a lot of these realists decided to kind of move away from where the French Royal Academy was in Paris and go to areas outside of Paris to paint and display their work. And a lot of these realist artists established what was called the Barbizon School. And the Barbizon School really emphasized the ideas of realism, of painting what was in front of you, what was of the time, and if you wanted to use it to send a message like Milay did or Daumier or Courbet, you could. And realists with the Barbizon School actually started to make popular painting outside or on plein airs, because if you're going to capture a landscape, be outside to paint it. It's not an idealized place in your head, it's a real place. So you should go outside and learn to paint. So for example, this one right here I really like because you can even see the shadows of the clouds floating over the land. And that's not really something you can accurately picture by doing it within a building. So another really cool thing that's going to happen because of realism is more advances in photography, like taking photography to an even more realistic level. And we see this with the creation of the Scope Praxis Scope. So the Scope Praxis Scope was created by Edvard Muybridge, and it actually is the early beginnings of cinematography, all right? So actually creating moving images. So what these people would do is they would take multiple images of something moving, like capturing it over time. Instead of getting all of it at once, like on a photography reel, they would take the different pictures and then they would put them on this wheel that would project an image of the object moving. So multiple exposures using a camera, and then getting it to where you could do images like this, like the pole vaulter, which was taken using a Scope Praxis Scope to actually start showing photography in motion, which is something that painting couldn't do. So it's kind of like this one-upping that they were doing between photographers at the time, who obviously could truly capture something real by just that true image, or artists like painters who are trying to capture a realistic movement. Well, this can capture several movements in motion. So for example, this is Horse Jumping by Edvard Muybridge, which captured all the scenes of a horse jumping, and he would put them together on that wheel, and then it would actually project this image of the horse jumping. So not only do we have a realistic scene, now we have it in realistic motion because of the zoo Praxis Scope. So it kind of looked like this. Okay, so we're going to stop here. And when we pick up with part 2, we will look at realism as it comes to the Americas. And we will also be looking at realistic sculpture.